Before I left London, a new book was published and it was launched, and it's called King Charles III, 40 Years of Architecture. And the book describes the lead the king took all those years ago, which began the journey to the revival that we are now seeing in traditional architecture. And I thought how clever it was of the organizers of the Norwegian Beauty and Architecture Symposia to have chosen May as the time for these gatherings. Because it was in May 1984 when the struggle really began, almost exactly 41 years ago now, when the king kicked off the campaign with a dramatic speech, which has since come to be known as his carbuncle speech, which he made to the Royal Institute of British Architects at a dinner at Hampton Court Palace, where all the great and the good in British architecture had gathered to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Institute. The young prince stunned everyone by lambasting his audience of distinguished architects for consistently ignoring the wishes of the masses of the ordinary people in the country. You can imagine the outrage that this caused. But this was the moment that brought the issue of architecture and the environment into the public eye. He gave ordinary people, just as we've been listening to now, this was in Britain at least, a voice to criticize what architects have been doing to our towns and cities for so long. May is also a significant anniversary for me, as May 1987 was the date of the Paternoster Square exhibition, the project that launched my career in classical architecture. I designed the replacement buildings to these you see here at Paternoster Square by St. Paul's Cathedral that had been built in 1967. Astonishingly, these by 1987 had already been declared obsolete only 20 years after construction. With planning permission fees raised from a London newspaper, the Evening Standard, I put together and submitted a counter-proposal to the City of London, proposing a mix of uses, restoring the urban grain around the cathedral and allowing the dome of St. Paul's to dominate the skyline again, surrounded by the spires and towers of the churches, as Christopher Wren intended. The purpose was to show just what a genuine traditional scheme would look like and why it was so necessary by St. Paul's. The exhibitions that followed were probably the first time, for a long while at least, that the principles of traditional urbanism and planning were given a true airing, and the public loved them. The king followed with what has come to be known as his Luftwaffe speech, which he delivered at the Mansion House that December, and the rest, as they say, is history, as this scheme was given planning permission and replaced the modernist scheme that was originally proposed. In May 2, this time in 1989, saw the launch of the King's Book describing the vision of Britain, followed by Poundbury, which has since has inspired many other landowners across the world to do the same, in Britain, in the US, in Europe, and other parts of the world. And it would be safe to say that a consensus is gradually emerging, even within the modernist circles, that at a planning level at least, mixed use and places created around walkable streets and squares like Poundbury is a more sustainable way to build that better provides for the future and the well-being of inhabitants. And most significant of all, as we've been hearing over the last couple of days, there's been an enormous amount of work that's been done over the last 30 years in the field of traditional architecture across the world in so many spheres. Highways engineering techniques and transport design have been refined to be less brutal to the urban environment. New financial models have been devised, facilitating longer-term sustainable development. We heard from Anne and Abigail how research in neuroscience is being very supportive to traditional architecture. And as Joanna outlined in her lecture yesterday, new ways of building have been developed new ways of building have been developed which allow us to be able to build today within the context of the existing building industry, that allow us to build buildings which will last, which will grow old gracefully, and just like they did in the past. Now, let's find where I am. So there we are. Unfortunately today, we don't have the luxury to rely on the slow incremental organic growth that gave rise to beautiful places like this, along Trinity Street in Cambridge. This is because today the demand for new places to live in is such that whole towns or cities' quarters need to be built simultaneously to satisfy the shortfall. Our techniques, therefore, have to generate the required variety of buildings and architecture as part of the initial design of the master plan. This is not something unusual. We know from a city like Bath, largely created by two architects, John Wood the Elder and his son John Wood the Younger, that this is an extremely successful way to create a city. So how do we go about a master plan for a new village that will result in the variety and architecture that you see in this Cotswold example? Well, perhaps we might begin by considering why it is that towns and villages like this in England are characterized by the terraced houses that you see here, whereas in Italian cities it would be palazzi, and in Paris by houseman blocks. Why is it that the morphology and organization of urban blocks is so different in each, when you consider that in most cases they originate in a common source and were established in the first instance as Roman settlements and towns, which had a pattern of streets that would have looked a bit like this at Pompeii in southern Italy, usually with a relatively orthogonal, regular grid, devised so as to accommodate small courtyard houses, probably like this, with atria and colonnaded gardens that you see here. Pompeii may have been preserved within the ashes of Vesuvius, much the way it was in Pliny's day, but other places and other cities, like Florence, for instance, have had over 2,000 years or so to shape the city. And you see the street pattern of the old Roman settlement endure today in the layout of the center of Florence, having started life off probably as a regular grid with urban blocks divided, much like those of Pompeii, to accommodate similar terraced courtyard buildings. But then as the inhabitants of the city grew wealthier, the smaller plots gradually become amalgamated as the wealthy buy out their neighbors. And this carries on gradually until, eventually, whole blocks are amalgamated into a single large building. And hey presto, the palazzo is born. Whereas in Italy, the courtyard appears to have been the driving factor that shaped the development of the city block. In Paris, which also starts with similar Roman origins, it's the plot boundaries rather than the courtyard which take precedence in the process of the evolution of the Parisian block. As you see from these surviving French buildings from the medieval period, unlike Florence, instead of expanding the block sideways, as Paris became more prosperous, buildings grew vertically, sometimes becoming 4 or even 5 stories high, while still confined within the original plot boundaries, which in later years eventually amalgamate with adjacent plots leading to the houseman buildings so characteristic of Paris today. The result is that they retain no proper coherent courtyard as their Italian counterparts do. Here the courtyard we're left with is simply a functional light well, as you see here. So in designing a master plan for a new urban quarter to the city of Bologna, we've extended the city, as you see here, using Italian courtyard block structure, so that when you apply a similar architecture, it becomes a seamless addition to the existing city. In Puteaux, in Paris, we're working within the Parisian vernacular there, for precisely the same reason. Meanwhile, in Britain, being an island, cities escaped the pressure of being confined within city walls at a much earlier date, with the result that the houses on individual plots survived, as space was never a serious issue. The resultant form that developed was the terraced house with a mews at the back. This is an economic, practical, and convenient way to organize a city that is relatively straightforward to replicate, and is one that the Georgians and later the Victorians used to great effect to configure cities into patterns of streets and squares, as you can see here at Eaton Square in Belgravia. With the main house arranged along the street, at the front of the plot, and a small mews building at the end of the garden. The mews buildings look like this, many originally built to accommodate a stable and perhaps a coach, with some staff accommodation on the upper floors. These buildings were accessed from a functional area called a mews, located within the heart of an urban block. The main facades and the facade of the house faced the street, which as a result retained a relatively manicured and formal character, away from the mews, which were firmly kept separated from the street, usually behind an archway like this. Over the years, mews have proved to be very adaptable, where stables have turned into garages for cars, staff accommodation into working studios, small flats, little offices. Mews are also very useful in that they make it possible to accommodate a wide social mix of accommodation and a mix of uses within very close proximity, and do so universally right across the city. This is an example of how a mews is used in a modern development today at Old Church Street in the centre of London in Chelsea. This is a new development, and buildings that you see here, they're all new, basically, which we designed to continue the character of the varied frontages along the street, with a new vicarage in the foreground, a large bow-fronted house, and then two matching houses beyond. At the other end of the street, you see here is a building with an arch that leads into the mews within the heart of the block, where an existing industrial building at the back was converted into apartments, and new cottages were added, making it an attractive place within the city in which to live. Clearly, when you're working within an existing town or city, you're stitching into the existing fabric and working with the existing urban morphology. We designed new buildings, such as in Poundbury, and where we do that, we use the prevalent morphology for the design so that it remains rooted in the locality. This is why modernist layouts for a city such as Milton Keynes, with a form so different from everything around it, feels alien and out of place. This is an area we designed in Poundbury, setting out a new square with terraced buildings. Yellow stock bricks were used for the houses, with the arched red brick building you see here forming the centerpiece to Wadham Square and provides space for employment. The terraced houses together form a unified facade that defines one side of the square in the traditional manner, using recessed arches around windows and finishes with a flourish at the end with a larger house. Behind the houses are gardens, and you can see the lane on the right leading to the mews in the center of the block. There are covered arcade spaces under the building in the center of the square. A mix of different houses of different sizes, providing greater variation along the surrounding streets. Here's a mews building, which provides space for a garage and an accommodation for a small flat or a workshop at the top. And you can just see that at the end of the garden as you look down the side of the block towards the rear of the house, right there at the end. And there are some individual houses that we introduced with an occasional collegiate type arrangement of buildings intermingled with the terraces to provide space for apartments and an element of mixed use. This is consistent with an English town and is one way of building in variety. But the most common way of building in and creating variety is really through the architecture of the buildings, which can be done to give a building more prominence. The Market Building, the first public building to be built at Poundbury, is an example. It was on Paternoster Square in the first phase, which was laid out, designed along an irregular, informal, urban pattern. So as to give it additional gravitas, it seemed appropriate to make it work in the manner of a public building within a medieval town, and the architecture was devised so that it would stand apart from its surroundings and contrast with the relatively ordinary Georgian vernacular residential buildings around it. It's designed to look almost as if it's a survival from an earlier era, perhaps of Norman origins. Otherwise, we expect towns and cities to contain a variety of buildings, sometimes with different architecture, which in an existing city would have been built by successive generations. Here is an example of an existing town, a street in Wokingham. You see the buildings which would have been sequentially erected along the street, starting with the Georgian buildings you see in the distance that slowly give way to Victorian and then Edwardian houses to the left of the picture. It all makes for a picturesque streetscape that you might well wish to emulate in a design. If so, you do well to remember that a person doesn't have to be an architectural historian to have a general picture of the relative sequence of architectural styles, or to know that settlements like this village follow a pattern that has the older buildings around the center, possibly around a church or a square. Which is why we know, for instance, if we want to head to the church, that we would head to the church tower in the middle of this picture when we're looking for the main square of this hill town in Tuscany. We would do that rather than head for the stone tower that you see here on the right. Or if we're looking to get to the center of Wokingham, we would decide to carry on walking along this street towards the Georgian houses and would expect to find the town square or the high street not long after we turn the corner. These are examples of common patterns we all recognize. And as any neuroscientist will tell you, we as human beings are very good at spotting patterns. We do this subconsciously all the time, looking for clues to place ourselves within our surroundings, which we usually do without the benefit of a map or instructions. The problems begin when we find ourselves in a place where we can't do this. Places where the architecture variety has been randomly introduced and not to any discernible pattern. And this becomes a problem because the building stop imparting to us the information that we're looking for. So even more significantly, the information that we get from this random mix will be disorientating and very confusing. It's like being bombarded with a constant visual noise. And once we realize this, we naturally switch off to it because we know that the information we're getting is misleading. This is why when in a suburban development or a housing estate, where this kind of thing is often done, we stop taking notice of the differences, so the whole place begins to read exactly the same. It has the exact opposite effect that intended by the architect who designed it. So in order to avoid this phenomenon, we need to realize that if we're to use architecture in this way, we are no longer simply dealing with a three-dimensional entity, but introducing a fourth dimension into the design. And just as with any other design decision, introducing this sort of pattern needs to be one that's considered and deliberate. To control and implement variety like this has to be part of a master, like this, as part of a master plan, you need to have design codes. And this plan that you see here is an example of a new development we've been working on near Braintree on the Essex-Suffolk border. It's for a small market town of about 8,000 houses. To achieve the variety of character across the town, we've allocated buildings into a series of zones where different architectural codes apply. This way, there's a coherent pattern to the variations of the architecture that we introduce. So the red area that you see there has an architectural code that derives from 18th century Essex balloon frame timber buildings and is intended to have a village character. The blue area has a design code which is more like a town, an urban in character, with an architecture derived from brick and stucco buildings of 19th century origin. To achieve the character across the town, we've allocated buildings into series. Oh, I've actually gone the wrong direction. Have I? Sorry. Right, that's where we should be. Then there's another yellow zone too, and the whole design, there's a whole pattern design there, which is suggestive of a town that has grown by coagulating a group of existing villages. This naturally gives each area its individual character, while at the same time holding the development together within a pattern that's discernible and consistent and helps us find our way around. The areas colored in red, like the quarter you see on the right, would look something like this. Oops. Like this, following the architectural code delivered from the buildings within the colorful adjacent village of Coggeshall that you see in the inset picture there. Oops, it's jumping, sorry. Whereas the blue and yellow areas follow their own design code, which would look something more like this. It's jumping 2 slides at a time, I'm afraid. This is a town called Terrace in France, where we were commissioned to design buildings deliberately intended to look English and be part of a designated English quarter in the master plan. We were asked to base the architecture of the buildings, and you've probably already guessed, on John Nash at Regent's Park. It's jumping again. Where apartments are arranged behind great palace facades, forming streets and squares. But I felt that doing that was simply not enough, and that we needed to find a way to tie our buildings more closely with their locality in some way. So we came up with a reason that allowed us to intermingle within the development some buildings that were recognizably derivative of French classical sources. Let's see if this works. So we then devised a scenario, therefore, where some of the buildings could have survived from an earlier period, and where the gatehouses, orangeries, and estate buildings belonging to an older chateau that had been taken down, possibly following the Revolution, sometime before the site was subsequently developed. And then so as to create the English quarter of Cerise. There are some interesting, these are some of the streets of the French estate cottages, which then help explain how the transition into the English architecture ties into Cerise and make it all the more intriguing. Right, I'm sorry I'm having to sort of go forward to and then one back. Finally, this is another development that we're currently working on, south of Cambridge. Again, it's a town of around 8,000 houses. It's located in Cambridge, where a significant amount of employment exists in the surrounding area. Due to this, and the spin-off generated from scientific research at Cambridge University, this town has the potential to accommodate an unusual number of services and service facilities, as well as shops, cafes, restaurants, and is also considered a good place to incorporate accommodation for new startup companies. On the other hand, Cambridge is also short of good quality family homes needed to encourage young graduates working in the biomedical and AI research to stay locally and not be tempted off to go to Silicon Valley. Sorry about this. So it wouldn't have been inconceivable. Sorry. Oops. I'm sorry about this, it's just, yeah. It just so happens that our site is on the crossroads of two ancient Roman roads. And you can see the configuration of the fields in the center of the site really follow an unusually orthogonal pattern. So it wouldn't have been inconceivable that these field boundaries might have followed those of an ancient Roman field encampment. And that might have developed into settlement in post-Roman times, to become a small market town that's serving the surrounding area, which grows. Sorry, this is just, I'm terribly sorry, but looks like it's. What's wrong? Is there any way of doing something about this? Yeah, maybe try that. Yeah. And just like Florence had grown naturally over subsequent years with 3 new quarters outside the original boundary of the settlement, that might have developed into to become a small market town serving the surrounding area. This gave us the excuse to introduce 2 forms of development with a morphology with regular blocks of a size within the central area, more able and more suited to accommodate an urban center with a higher level of mixed-use development. So the town would provide the space and the services to do business so that people didn't always have to travel all the way into the center of Cambridge, as you see here. Then the morphology of the areas surrounding that central area were deliberately chosen so as to more closely resemble that of the surrounding area in Cambridge and provide the environment conducive to building family houses to attract people to stay. I think I've overrun my time and have said enough, except to say how impressed I am by everything that I've seen here at the symposium, and especially by the determination and the enthusiasm of so many young people here who I've met who are interested in traditional architecture. I believe there is a step change going on, and so much more so than I have experienced, than may be experienced, that we may be experiencing the development and the dawning of a new age, one that's going to be essential if we're going to put right the enormous damage that has been done to the environment over the last century. If this momentum is carried on, which I hope it very much will, we might be seeing the dawn of a new age of Reconstruction.